The winter morning of January 28th, 2018, started like any other for Harry Gandert. At exactly 6:56 a.m., he picked up his phone to make the call he'd made every morning for years, checking in on his sister Marilyn. But this morning would be different. This morning would shatter everything he thought he knew about family, trust, and the people we hold closest to our hearts. Harry pressed the familiar numbers, listening as the phone rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. That wasn't like Marilyn. She always answered his calls, morning and night, without fail. A knot began forming in his stomach as he tried again. Straight to voicemail. Something was terribly wrong. The routine had been sacred between the siblings. Every morning at 7, every evening at 9, Harry would call his younger sister. It was more than just a check-in. It was a lifeline connecting two people who had weathered life storms together. At 62, Harry understood the importance of these connections. After losing so much over the years, he and Marilyn had become each other's constants in an unpredictable world. Marilyn Gandert was 68 years old, a woman who had learned to find peace in solitude after experiencing more than her share of heartbreak. Her husband had passed away years earlier, leaving a void that never quite filled. Then came the devastating blow that nearly broke her completely: her son Ryan's suicide in 2014. The tragedy had changed everything for Marilyn, transforming her from a social, outgoing woman into someone who preferred the quiet sanctuary of her modest Albuquerque home. But even in her grief-induced isolation, Marilyn maintained certain routines that kept her connected to the world. She never missed Harry's calls. She never failed to return messages from her few close friends. She was reliable to a fault, predictable in the best possible way. That's why Harry's growing panic wasn't just brotherly concern. It was the recognition that something fundamental had shifted in their carefully ordered world. 20 miles north of his Albuquerque home, Harry drove to his sister's house with growing dread. The 62-year-old man had been through enough heartbreak in his life, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to discover. As he pulled into Marilyn's driveway, everything looked normal at first glance. Her car sat in its usual spot, undisturbed. The house appeared quiet and peaceful in the early morning light. The neighborhood was one of those middle-class enclaves where people knew each other's routines without necessarily being close friends. Marilyn's house was well-maintained but unremarkable, the kind of place where a retired woman could live out her days in comfortable anonymity. Harry had visited countless times over the years, knew every corner of the property, every quirk of the old building. But normalcy was an illusion. Harry noticed the note he'd left on her door the previous day was still there, untouched and sealed exactly as he'd left it. His heart began racing as he knocked on the door, calling out his sister's name. The sound echoed hollowly, seeming to bounce off empty walls. No response. He walked around the property, peering through windows, but the blinds were drawn tight. The silence was deafening, oppressive in a way that made his skin crawl. Harry tried the front door handle locked. He checked the windows, all secure. Everything about the house suggested normal security precautions, but combined with Marilyn's uncharacteristic silence, these ordinary details took on sinister implications. Where was she? Why wasn't she answering? And most disturbingly, why was her car still in the driveway if she'd gone somewhere? That's when Harry knew he had to call for help. With trembling fingers, he dialed 911, his voice betraying the fear that had been building all morning. Albuquerque Police, how can I help you? Yes, this is Harry. I'm at my sister's house, and she's not here. I haven't been able to get hold of her, and she usually gets back to me because I call her every morning and night. Her phone has been offline. The dispatcher could hear the worry creeping into Harry's voice as he explained the situation. This wasn't just any missing person report. There was something in Harry's tone that suggested genuine fear, the kind that comes from knowing someone intimately and recognizing when something is fundamentally wrong. What's your sister's name? The dispatcher asked, beginning to gather the essential information. Marilyn Gandert, Harry replied, his voice steadier now that he was taking action. But her vehicle's here, and that's how she travels. The note I left yesterday is still in the door. I'm getting really worried now. Marilyn Gandert wasn't just any missing person. She was a creature of habit, a woman whose routine was as predictable as sunrise. At 68 years old, she lived a quiet, solitary life in her modest home, rarely venturing far from her comfort zone. She was the type of person who planned her grocery trips, who let people know when she'd be away, who never left her beloved dog alone without making arrangements. The dispatcher assured Harry that officers would be dispatched immediately. But even as he hung up the phone, Harry felt a creeping dread that something terrible had already happened. He'd known Marilyn his entire life, had watched her evolve from an outgoing young woman to a widow, then to a grieving mother, and finally to someone who found solace in routine and predictability. She didn't break patterns without reason. Within minutes, police officers arrived at the scene. Officer Barnhill, a veteran with years of experience in missing person cases, immediately began gathering information from Harry. The brother's concern was palpable, but his answers were clear and detailed, the hallmarks of someone who genuinely knew the missing person's habits and routines. As they spoke with Harry, trying to piece together when Marilyn had last been seen, a woman approached them from across the street. She was middle-aged, well-dressed, with the purposeful stride of someone who had important information to share. "Are you worried about Marilyn, too?" Nicole Robinson asked, her face etched with concern that mirrored Harry's own fears. Nicole was more than just a neighbor. She was Marilyn's closest friend, perhaps her only real confidant in recent years. The two women had worked together at the post office for over a decade, developing the kind of friendship that transcends workplace boundaries. Even after retirement, they maintained regular contact, checking in on each other with the devotion of sisters. "I haven't been able to get hold of her for a couple of days, and it's just not like her," Nicole continued, her voice tight with worry. "She never misses work, never fails to return calls, and she would never leave her dog alone like this without telling someone." Nicole's words confirmed Harry's worst fears while adding new dimensions to the mystery. This wasn't just about missed phone calls. It was about a complete break in Marilyn's established patterns of behavior. For a woman who lived by routine, such a dramatic departure suggested something catastrophic had occurred. The officers began their investigation by circling the house, looking for signs of forced entry or struggle. The front door was secure, windows intact, no obvious signs of break-in. The yard was neat and undisturbed, showing no evidence of a struggle or hasty departure. Everything appeared normal from the outside, which somehow made the situation more ominous. But when they reached the back of the house, they discovered something that sent chills down their spines. The sliding door was wide open, swaying gently in the winter breeze. The door opened onto a small patio area that was visible from the street, yet no one had noticed it during the initial search. It was the kind of detail that transformed the situation from puzzling to potentially dangerous. Officer Barnhill immediately radioed for backup, explaining that they had a possible break-in situation with a missing resident. The open door could mean many things: that Marilyn had left in a hurry, that someone had entered the house, or that something violent had occurred inside. None of the possibilities were comforting. While waiting for additional officers, Barnhill spoke with Nicole, gathering more information about Marilyn's recent activities and state of mind. What he learned painted a picture of a woman dealing with increasing stress, particularly regarding her rental property and the tenants who live there. She'd been having problems with her daughter-in-law, Nicole explained, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Alyssa and her son had been living in Marilyn's rental house without paying rent consistently. It was causing her a lot of stress and heartache. This revelation added a troubling dimension to Marilyn's disappearance. Financial disputes, especially those involving family members, had been known to escalate into violence. The fact that Marilyn had been dealing with difficult tenants who happened to be related to her, suggested potential motives for foul play. After calling for backup, the officers entered the house with weapons drawn, calling out warnings as they moved from room to room. The standard protocol for clearing a house where the occupants' whereabouts were unknown, especially when there were signs of possible intrusion. "Albuquerque Police Department, we're coming inside," Officer Barnhill announced loudly. "If anyone is in the house, make your presence known now. Come to the front door with your hands visible and empty." The house responded with silence, an empty echo that seemed to confirm their worst fears. As they moved through the rooms systematically, the officers noted details that would later prove significant. The house was neat, but showed signs of recent activity. Pill bottles scattered on a table, medical paperwork spread across a counter, reading glasses left on an open book. The kitchen showed evidence of interrupted activity, a coffee cup half full and cold, suggesting Marilyn had been in the middle of her morning routine when something had happened. The living room was tidy, except for a throw pillow on the floor, a small detail that might have been meaningless or might have indicated a struggle. In the bedroom, officers found Marilyn's purse sitting on the dresser, wallet intact with cash and credit cards untouched. Her reading glasses were folded neatly beside the bed, and her medication organizer showed that she'd taken her morning pills. These details suggested that whatever had happened to Marilyn had occurred after she'd begun her normal daily routine. The house was eerily quiet, but what they found inside was even more disturbing than what they didn't find. Marilyn's personal belongings were scattered about in a way that suggested normal living, but there were subtle signs that something had been amiss. The medical paperwork wasn't just spread out, it was disorganized in a way that didn't match the neat, orderly way Marilyn typically arranged things. But the most chilling discovery was hanging right there on the front door handle. Marilyn's house keys and car keys, dangling as if she'd been interrupted while trying to leave, or as if someone wanted it to look that way. The keys were attached to a small keychain that Harry recognized immediately, a gift he'd given her the previous Christmas. "That's not right," Harry said when officers showed him the keys. "Marilyn would never leave her keys hanging like that. She's very particular about security, especially after some break-ins in the neighborhood last year." The keys represented more than just an unusual detail. They were evidence that Marilyn's disappearance hadn't been planned. If she'd intended to go somewhere, she would have taken her keys. If she'd been abducted from inside the house, the keys wouldn't have been hanging on the door. The placement suggested either extreme carelessness on Marilyn's part, which was completely out of character, or deliberate staging by someone else. As the search for Marilyn intensified, police learned about a rental property she owned nearby. Nicole provided the address, explaining that Marilyn's daughter-in-law, Alyssa, and her family had been living there, but were in the process of moving out due to ongoing disputes over rent and property maintenance. The situation had gotten really tense, Nicole explained to the investigating officers. Marilyn had finally decided she'd had enough of the broken promises and missed payments. She was going through the eviction process, which had made things very uncomfortable for everyone involved. The rental property was less than 2 miles from Marilyn's house, close enough that she could easily check on it regularly. According to Nicole, Marilyn had been visiting the property frequently in recent weeks, partly to monitor the moving process and partly to assess what repairs would be needed once the tenants were gone. Officers decided to check the rental property, both as a possible location where Marilyn might be found and as a source of information from the tenants who knew her routine. What they found instead was a family in the middle of what appeared to be a routine moving day. But appearances, as they would soon learn, can be devastatingly deceiving. The rental house was a modest single-story home in a working-class neighborhood, similar in style to Marilyn's own residence, but slightly smaller and showing signs of deferred maintenance. As officers pulled up to the property, they could see a pickup truck in the driveway with the tailgate down, boxes and furniture scattered around, as if in the middle of a move. Alyssa Bickett, 43 years old, was loading boxes into the truck when officers approached. She appeared calm and cooperative, showing no signs of distress or surprise at seeing police. With her was her 20-year-old son Drake, Marilyn's grandson, and a friend named Annie Rail who appeared to be helping with the move. "What's going on?" Officer Barnhill asked as he approached the group, his tone professional but alert for any signs of deception or nervousness. "I'm moving out," Alyssa replied calmly, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Her demeanor was relaxed and cooperative, showing none of the tension one might expect from someone involved in a contentious eviction proceeding. Alyssa Bickett represented a complicated family dynamic that had become increasingly strained over the years. She was the widow of Marilyn's son Ryan, who had tragically taken his own life in 2014. After Ryan's death, Marilyn had tried to maintain a relationship with her daughter-in-law and grandson, partly out of love and partly out of a desire to honor her son's memory by caring for his family. The relationship had started well enough. Marilyn had offered Alyssa and Drake a place to live in her rental property at below market rent, understanding that they were struggling financially in the aftermath of Ryan's death. What began as a temporary arrangement to help family members get back on their feet had stretched into years of increasing frustration and resentment. When officers explained they were looking for Marilyn, Alyssa seemed genuinely helpful and concerned. She pulled out her phone without hesitation, scrolling through her text messages to show officers her recent communications with her mother-in-law. The last message I got from her was Friday, January 26th at 10:35 a.m., Alyssa explained, holding up her phone for the officers to see. She was here that day, and we were hanging out, talking about the move, and tying up loose ends. The text conversation appeared routine, discussions about returning keys, finalizing the move-out date, and ensuring the property was left in good condition. Nothing in the messages suggested conflict or tension, though officers noted that text messages rarely captured the full emotional context of difficult relationships. She doesn't always answer me right away, Alyssa continued, her tone suggesting this was a normal pattern. Sometimes she gets busy or forgets to respond, so I didn't think anything of it when she didn't get back to my later messages. Drake, Marilyn's grandson, stood nearby during this conversation, but his demeanor struck officers as odd. While his mother appeared engaged and cooperative, Drake seemed distant, almost detached from the proceedings. He answered direct questions with minimal responses and avoided eye contact, behavior that could be attributed to shyness or could indicate something more troubling. The officers asked permission to search the rental house, a standard request when investigating a missing person case involving locations the person was known to frequent. Alyssa immediately agreed without hesitation or consultation with the others present. "That's perfectly fine. I have no problem with that," she said, stepping aside to give officers clear access to the house. "I understand you need to check everywhere she might be." As they walked through the house, everything appeared normal for a residence in the process of being vacated. Boxes were stacked neatly in most rooms. Furniture had been moved away from walls, and there were the typical signs of a thorough cleaning in progress. The house was older but well-maintained, showing signs of Marilyn's attention to keeping her rental property in good condition. Alyssa provided a tour of the house, explaining which rooms had been used for what purposes and pointing out areas where repairs or improvements might be needed once they were gone. She seemed knowledgeable about the property's quirks and maintenance needs, suggesting a familiarity that came from years of residence. When pressed about where Marilyn might be, Alyssa offered several possibilities. Sometimes she visits her friend Nicole, or she might have gone to the doctor. She's been having some health issues lately and has been going to appointments more frequently. This information aligned with what officers had observed at Marilyn's house. The medical paperwork and prescription bottles suggested someone managing ongoing health concerns. However, Nicole had already been contacted and confirmed she hadn't seen or heard from Marilyn in several days. Sometimes she gets mad and won't talk to anyone for a while, Alyssa added with what appeared to be genuine understanding of Marilyn's personality. "She's been pretty cordial with me lately, though. I'm just trying to get my stuff out and make this transition as smooth as possible for everyone." The officers left the rental property without finding anything suspicious, but they had established important timeline information. According to Alyssa, she was the last known person to see Marilyn alive on Friday, January 26th. This timeline would later prove to be crucial, though not for the reasons anyone initially suspected. What the officers didn't know at the time was that this seemingly routine moving day was actually the cover-up for one of the most brutal family murders in Albuquerque's recent history. The calm cooperation they witnessed was an elaborate performance designed to deflect suspicion from the very people responsible for Marilyn's disappearance. But this story doesn't begin with Marilyn's disappearance on January 28th. The real beginning of this tragedy occurred 2 days earlier, on the evening of January 26th, when a woman driving home from work in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, witnessed something that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Rio Rancho is a sprawling suburban community northwest of Albuquerque, known for its newer developments and growing population. But like many expanding cities, it also has areas of undeveloped land, dirt roads, and isolated stretches where someone could dispose of evidence without immediate detection. The woman, whose name was withheld to protect her privacy, was driving home from her evening shift at a local medical facility. It was a route she'd taken hundreds of times, familiar enough that she could navigate it almost automatically. The January night was cold and clear, with little traffic on the secondary roads that led to her neighborhood. As she drove along one of these quiet dirt roads, something caught her attention in her peripheral vision. On the side of the road, perhaps 50 yards from the pavement, she saw what appeared to be a dark pile that was smoldering, sending thin wisps of black smoke into the cold night air. Initially, she assumed it was brush or trash that someone had been burning illegally, not uncommon in areas where people dispose of yard waste or unwanted items. But something about the scene bothered her, nagging at her consciousness as she continued home. The shape wasn't quite right, the smoke pattern seemed unusual, and there was an indefinable quality about the scene that felt wrong. The image stayed with her through the night, interrupting her sleep and occupying her thoughts. By morning, she had convinced herself that she needed to take another look, if only to put her mind at ease. She asked her husband to accompany her, partly for safety and partly for a second opinion on what they might find. What they discovered in the harsh light of day was far worse than anything either of them could have imagined. The dark pile wasn't brush or trash. It was the burned remains of what was unmistakably a human being. At 11:42 a.m. on January 27th, the husband called 911 with hands that shook so violently he could barely hold the phone. 911, what's your emergency? Tell me exactly what happened, the dispatcher requested after the caller reported finding what he believed to be human remains. We think we found a body out here, the man said, his voice tight with horror and disbelief. It's on a road, and somebody had put on like a mattress or something and burned it. It looks like it has bones in it, and you can see intestines and guts. I don't know, it's weird. The dispatcher immediately dispatched multiple units to the scene, including detectives, the medical examiner's office, and crime scene technicians. What they found when they arrived was a scene of almost incomprehensible brutality and callousness. Deputies rushed to the remote location, following the caller's directions to a dirt road that was rarely traveled except by local residents and off-road enthusiasts. The burned remains were exactly as described, clearly human, clearly the victim of extreme violence, and clearly placed where they would eventually be discovered. What they found was a nightmare beyond description. The burned remains were so badly damaged that immediate identification seemed impossible, but certain details were unmistakably human and deeply disturbing. The body appeared small, possibly that of a child or elderly person, with what looked like metal chains or restraints around the wrists and ankles that had been twisted tight enough to cut into the flesh. Even more horrifying, the right foot had been severed completely, apparently cut off with a sharp instrument before the body was burned. Most disturbing of all, the victim's mouth was frozen open in what appeared to be a final, silent scream. Whether from pain, terror, or the process of burning, investigators couldn't immediately determine. The scene showed clear evidence of deliberate staging. The body had been placed on what appeared to be an old mattress, then doused with an accelerant, most likely gasoline based on the burn patterns and residual odor, before being set ablaze. This wasn't someone trying to hide evidence. This was someone sending a message. The location itself was significant. While remote enough to avoid immediate detection, it was on a road that was used regularly by local residents. Whoever had chosen this spot wanted the body to be found, but not immediately. They wanted time for the fire to do its work, but they also wanted the discovery to be inevitable. This wasn't just a murder, this was a statement. Someone had wanted this body to be found in this condition, wanted the horror to be witnessed and remembered. The level of brutality suggested either extreme rage or a calculated attempt to obscure the victim's identity and the circumstances of their death. As standard procedure in any homicide investigation, the people who discovered the body were immediately considered potential suspects until they could be cleared. The couple was questioned extensively, their backgrounds checked, and their alibi for the previous days verified. Within hours, investigators were satisfied that they were simply unfortunate witnesses to someone else's crime. Crime scene technicians worked methodically to document every detail of the scene. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, measurements recorded, and samples collected for laboratory analysis. The burned mattress and surrounding soil were carefully examined for any evidence that might identify the victim or provide clues about the perpetrator. The medical examiner's office began the difficult process of examining the remains. Despite the extensive burning, certain features were still identifiable. The victim appeared to be an elderly female, small in stature, with dental work that might allow for identification if dental records could be located. As news of the discovered remains spread through law enforcement channels and eventually to the media, tips began pouring into the police department. Multiple missing person cases were reviewed, and several seemed potentially relevant. Each tip was investigated, each missing person considered, but one call stood out from the others. Nicole Robinson, Marilyn's friend who had been with Harry when police first searched Marilyn's house, called the tip line after seeing news reports about the discovered remains. The description of an elderly female, small in stature, found in Rio Rancho matched her missing friend too closely to ignore. "I think it might be Marilyn Gandert," Nicole told the detective who took her call. "She's been missing since Friday, and the description matches. She's small, elderly, and she's been having problems with her tenants. I'm really worried it might be her." Nicole provided Marilyn's dentist information, and within hours, dental records were being compared with the remains. The process was complicated by the extensive burning, but enough dental structure remained to make a positive identification possible. The confirmation came late on January 28th, just as Harry was beginning to hold on a hope that his sister might still be alive somewhere. The burned body found on that desolate road in Rio Rancho was indeed Marilyn Gandert. The next day, January 29th, officers made the journey to Harry's house to deliver the news that would shatter his world forever. Detective Rodriguez, a veteran investigator with experience in delivering such devastating news to families, knocked on Harry's door early in the morning. Harry knew before the detective said a word. The expression on Rodriguez's face, the formal way he introduced himself, the presence of a victim advocate, all of it pointed to the worst possible outcome. "I told you I was going to keep you updated on everything that's happening," Detective Rodriguez began gently. "The body that was found in Rio Rancho, the burned remains, has been positively identified as your sister Marilyn." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He doubled over as if punched in the stomach, his legs giving out beneath him. The strong, dignified man who had spent his life looking after his younger sister collapsed in grief as the reality hit him. Marilyn wasn't just missing. She was gone, taken from this world in the most brutal way imaginable. Oh God, Harry sobbed, his voice breaking with every word. The detective helped him to a chair as the full impact of the news sank in. This wasn't just about losing his sister. It was about the horrific way she had died, alone and terrified, at the hands of someone who had shown her no mercy. "She was a wonderful person and a very wonderful sister," Harry managed between sobs. "I miss her every day of my life. She was the type of person who would do anything for anyone. This shouldn't have happened to her." The detective allowed Harry time to process the news before beginning to ask the difficult questions that would help build a case against whoever was responsible. Harry's grief was raw and overwhelming, but his love for his sister motivated him to provide whatever information might help catch her killer. As investigators began piecing together Marilyn's final days, a troubling picture emerged of increasing tension and conflict in her life. Harry revealed details about his sister's ongoing problems with her rental property tenants that painted a very different picture from the cooperative, harmonious moving day that officers had witnessed. She was tired of the lies, tired of not getting paid, and tired of all the drama, Harry explained through his tears. Alyssa and her son had been living in Marilyn's house for years without paying rent consistently. They make promises, pay a little bit, then fall behind again. It was causing her tremendous stress. This revelation cast Alyssa's cooperative demeanor during the initial police contact in a completely different light. She hadn't been moving out, as she'd told officers. She had been evicted. She had been forced out by the very woman whose charred remains had just been identified on that lonely road. As investigators began piecing together Marilyn's final days, a troubling picture emerged of increasing tension and conflict in her life. Harry revealed details about his sister's ongoing problems with her rental property tenants that painted a very different picture from the cooperative, harmonious moving day that officers had witnessed. She was tired of the lies, tired of not getting paid, and tired of all the drama, Harry explained through his tears. Alyssa and her son had been living in Marilyn's house for years without paying rent consistently. They'd make promises, pay a little bit, then fall behind again. It was causing her tremendous stress. This revelation cast Alyssa's cooperative demeanor during the initial police contact in a completely different light. She hadn't been moving out, as she'd told officers. She had been evicted. She had been forced out by the very woman whose charred remains had just been identified on that lonely road. Harry provided more details about the deteriorating relationship between Marilyn and her daughter-in-law. What had started as a generous gesture to help family members after Ryan's tragic death had evolved into a source of constant stress and frustration for Marilyn. After Ryan died, Marilyn wanted to help Alyssa and Drake get back on their feet, Harry explained. She offered them the rental house at below-market rent, thinking it would be temporary until they could find steady work and save money. But years went by, and the promises never materialized into consistent rent payments. The situation had been complicated by Marilyn's desire to honor her deceased son's memory by caring for his family. She had endured years of broken promises and financial strain because she felt obligated to help her grandson and daughter-in-law. But by early 2018, even Marilyn's patience had reached its limit. She finally decided she'd had enough, Harry continued. She was going to sell the house, which meant Alyssa and Drake had to move out whether they wanted to or not. Marilyn had started the eviction process and was planning to put the house on the market. This background information suddenly made Alyssa's failure to mention the eviction during her initial interview with police seem less like an oversight and more like a calculated omission. Why would she lie about something so significant unless she had something to hide? The eviction process had been contentious and stressful for everyone involved. Marilyn had tried to be fair, giving Alyssa and Drake plenty of notice and time to find alternative housing. But the family dynamic had become increasingly toxic, with accusations and resentments on both sides. Marilyn felt taken advantage of, Harry explained. She'd been generous and patient for years, but Alyssa seemed to think she was entitled to live there rent-free indefinitely. When Marilyn finally put her foot down, things got really ugly really fast. As investigators returned to the rental house with search warrants, they found Alyssa still there, still packing, still maintaining the calm facade she displayed during their initial contact. But this time, armed with knowledge about the eviction and the context of Marilyn's relationship with her tenants, officers approached the scene with heightened suspicion. The search warrant allowed for a thorough examination of the property, and investigators worked methodically through every room, looking for any evidence that might connect the house to Marilyn's murder. What they found would transform the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide investigation with clear suspects. It was Detective Sarah Chun, a forensic specialist with years of experience in processing crime scenes, who noticed the crucial piece of evidence that everyone else had missed. As she examined the front entrance area with a high-powered flashlight, she spotted something that made her heart race: a tiny drop of blood on the wall near the doorway. The blood spot was minuscule, barely larger than a pinhead, and positioned in such a way that it would be easily overlooked during a casual inspection. But Chin's trained eye caught the telltale dark stain that stood out against the lighter-colored wall paint. "I need the luminol kit over here," Chin called out to her colleagues, her voice tight with excitement and apprehension. If this blood belonged to Marilyn Gandert, they had just found their primary crime scene. The luminol test, which reveals blood traces even after cleaning attempts, lit up the entire front area of the house like a Christmas tree. What had appeared to be a clean, normal entryway was actually the scene of extreme violence. Blood spatter patterns on the walls and ceiling indicated a brutal attack, while drag marks on the floor suggested the victim had been moved after the initial assault. The forensic evidence painted a horrifying picture of what had happened to Marilyn Gandert in that house. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of opportunity. This was a planned, brutal murder carried out in a location where the perpetrators felt safe and comfortable. While the house was being processed for evidence, word reached Alyssa that Marilyn's body had been found and identified. Her reaction, or rather, her lack of reaction, was telling to the investigators who were watching her carefully. She showed no surprise, no shock, no grief. Just a cold, calculated silence that made everyone present uncomfortable. When Detective Rodriguez informed Alyssa that her mother-in-law's body had been found, she simply nodded and said, "Okay." No questions about how Marilyn had died. No expressions of sympathy for Harry's loss. No apparent concern about her son Drake's reaction to losing his grandmother. Just clinical acceptance of information she seemed to already possess. Most people, when they hear that someone they know has been murdered, have questions. Detective Rodriguez would later testify. They want to know what happened, where the body was found, whether the killer has been caught. Alyssa's complete lack of curiosity was extremely suspicious. As more evidence emerged about the brutal nature of Marilyn's death, she had been beaten, bound, strangled, and stabbed before being doused with gasoline and set on fire. Investigators knew they were dealing with something far more sinister than a simple dispute over rent money. The level of violence suggested extreme personal rage, the kind that builds up over time and explodes in a frenzy of brutality. The fact that Marilyn had been restrained before being killed indicated premeditation, while the burning of her body showed a callous disregard for human dignity that shocked even experienced investigators. Detective Rodriguez and his team began building their case systematically, following the evidence wherever it led. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses, and traced Marilyn's movements in the days leading up to her disappearance. What they discovered was a pattern of escalating tension between Marilyn and her tenants, culminating in threats and accusations on both sides. Neighbors reported hearing loud arguments coming from the rental house in the weeks before Marilyn's death, and several witnesses had seen Marilyn visiting the property frequently, sometimes appearing distressed when she left. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators decided to arrest and formally interview the 3 people who had been present at the rental house during their initial visit: Alyssa Bickett, her son Drake, and their friend Annie Rail. Each would be questioned separately, and their stories would be compared for inconsistencies and contradictions. Drake was the first to be arrested, picked up at the hotel where he and his girlfriend had been staying since being evicted from the rental house. As officers placed him in handcuffs, the 20-year-old showed the same emotional detachment that had struck investigators during their initial contact. "You have any weapons on you?" Officer Martinez asked as he conducted a search incident to arrest. "No," Drake replied flatly, showing no curiosity about why he was being arrested or what charges he might face. Detective Rodriguez, who had developed a reputation for his skill in interrogating suspects, took the lead in questioning Drake. The young man was brought to an interview room at the Albuquerque Police Department, where he was read his Miranda rights and asked if he understood them. "Yeah, I understand," Drake said, his voice devoid of emotion or concern. The interrogation began with standard questions about Drake's relationship with his grandmother and his activities in the days leading up to her disappearance. Drake's answers were brief and seemingly truthful, but there was something unsettling about his demeanor that made investigators suspicious. "When was the last time you saw your grandmother?" Detective Rodriguez asked. "I don't remember exactly," Drake replied. "Maybe a few days ago, when she came by the house." "How did she seem when you saw her? Was she upset about anything?" "She was always upset about something," Drake said with what might have been a slight smirk. "She complained a lot." The detective pressed harder, asking about the eviction and the tensions surrounding the family's departure from the rental house. Drake admitted that his grandmother had been nagging them about moving out and that there had been some arguments about the situation. But it was when Detective Rodriguez revealed that Drake was being charged with his grandmother's murder that the young man made a statement that would shock everyone in the room and change the entire trajectory of the investigation. I wrote a warrant for you for the homicide of your grandmother, Detective Rodriguez said, watching Drake's face carefully for any reaction. So, I'm actually charging you with homicide of your grandmother. Okay, Drake replied with the same flat effect he'd maintained throughout the interview. Your mom's been arrested too, the detective continued. And Annie's been arrested as well. Again, Drake simply said, okay, as if he were being told about the weather rather than the arrest of his family members for murder. Then, without prompting or apparent emotion, Drake spoke directly into the camera that was recording the interview. What he said next would haunt everyone who heard it. My grandmother said, I'm too old. Will you please kill me? Multiple times, drunk and sober. That is honestly what happened. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Drake was claiming that his own grandmother had asked him to end her life, that this brutal murder was somehow an act of mercy requested by the victim herself. But investigators knew better. They'd seen the crime scene, witnessed the savagery of what had been done to Marilyn Gandert, examined the evidence of restraints and struggle. This was no mercy killing. This was cold-blooded murder, and Drake's attempt to justify it with claims of assisted suicide was both transparent and deeply disturbing. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward, pressing Drake for more details. So you're saying that at some point your grandmother asked you to kill her? Yeah, Drake replied without hesitation. Do you remember that day? Can we go back to that day in your memory and tell me what happened? Drake's story became rambling and inconsistent as he tried to construct a narrative that would justify his actions. He claimed that Marilyn had been depressed about her age and health problems, that she had repeatedly asked him to put her out of her misery. She would be like depressed, you know, Drake said, his voice taking on a slightly defensive tone. And like, she said that, I know she said that. So I passed her away. You know what I'm saying? The detective pressed for specifics about how the alleged mercy killing had been carried out, but Drake suddenly became evasive. I'd like to speak with a lawyer or public defender before I share any more, he said, effectively ending the interrogation just as it was getting to the crucial details. Drake had revealed enough to confirm investigators' suspicions while raising more questions than he'd answered. His claim of mercy killing was clearly an attempt to minimize his culpability, but the forensic evidence from the crime scene told a very different story. Meanwhile, in another interview room, Alyssa Bickett was facing her own interrogation with Detective Sarah Chun. Alyssa's story would prove to be dramatically different from her son's, revealing layers of deception and violence that painted a much clearer picture of what had actually happened to Marilyn Gandert. From the beginning, Alyssa's demeanor was different from Drake's emotional detachment. She appeared nervous, fidgety, and increasingly defensive as the questioning progressed. Unlike her son, who had maintained the same flat effect throughout his interview, Alyssa's emotional state seemed to fluctuate wildly. We know Marilyn was at your house on Friday, Detective Chin began. We know something happened there that resulted in her death. What I need from you is the truth about what occurred. Alyssa initially tried to maintain her innocence, claiming that she had last seen Marilyn on Friday morning when her mother-in-law had stopped by to check on the moving progress. But as the detective revealed more details about the forensic evidence, the blood in the house, the violence indicated by the spatter patterns, the obvious signs of a struggle, Alyssa's story began to crumble. There were some arguments, Alyssa finally admitted. Things got heated between us. She was being unreasonable about the move, demanding things that weren't fair. Detective Chun pressed for more details, and slowly, Alyssa began to reveal what had really happened in that house on January 26th. Her version of events was dramatically different from Drake's mercy-killing claim, painting a picture of escalating violence driven by anger and desperation. According to Alyssa, the confrontation had started when Marilyn arrived at the house unexpectedly, demanding to know why they hadn't finished packing and threatening to have them forcibly removed if they didn't accelerate their departure. She came in yelling and screaming, calling us worthless and ungrateful, Alyssa claimed. She said she was going to make sure we ended up on the street with nowhere to go. She was being cruel and vindictive. Alyssa admitted to hitting Marilyn during the argument, claiming it was in self-defense when her mother-in-law became physically aggressive. But the forensic evidence suggested something far more violent and premeditated than a simple altercation that got out of hand. Things escalated quickly. Alyssa continued, her voice becoming more agitated as she spoke. She was saying terrible things about Drake, about how he was just like his father, how he'd never amount to anything. I couldn't let her talk about my son that way. As the interrogation continued, Alyssa revealed more details about the attack, admitting that she had tied Marilyn up after hitting her. She claimed this was to prevent her mother-in-law from leaving and calling the police, but investigators suspected it was part of a more sinister plan. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do, Alyssa said. I didn't mean for things to go so far, but once it started, I couldn't take it back. The most disturbing part of Alyssa's confession came when she described leaving Marilyn bound and alone while she and Annie went to another part of the house. When she returned, according to her account, Annie was wiping blood from a knife. I don't know exactly what Annie did while I was gone, Alyssa claimed. When I came back, Marilyn she wasn't moving anymore. Annie had this knife, and there was blood everywhere. This version of events seemed designed to shift blame away from Alyssa and onto Annie Rail, painting Alyssa as someone who had gotten in over her head rather than the mastermind of a brutal murder. But investigators were skeptical of this account, especially given the forensic evidence and Drake's presence at the scene. Where was Drake during all this? Detective Chin asked. I don't know. Alyssa replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. He wasn't in the house when it happened to Marilyn. This claim directly contradicted other evidence investigators had gathered, including witness statements and Drake's own admissions during his interrogation. It became clear that Alyssa was trying to protect her son by minimizing his involvement in the murder, even as she attempted to shift blame onto Annie for the actual killing. The final piece of Alyssa's confession was perhaps the most chilling. She admitted to helping dispose of Marilyn's body, describing the process with a clinical detachment that shocked even experienced investigators. We loaded her onto an old mattress and put her in Annie's truck, Alyssa said, her voice becoming flat and emotionless. Then we drove out to that road in Rio Rancho. We unloaded the mattress, and I poured gasoline on it and lit it up. The casual way Alyssa described burning her mother-in-law's body was deeply disturbing to everyone who heard it. This wasn't someone overcome with remorse or horrified by their actions. This was someone who had methodically destroyed evidence of their crime with apparent indifference to the humanity of their victim. But Alyssa's story had significant holes and contradictions that didn't match the physical evidence or other witness accounts. Her attempts to minimize Drake's involvement and shift primary blame to Annie suggested a coordinated effort to protect certain family members while sacrificing others. The third interview with Annie Rail would provide the most complete and disturbing account of what had actually happened to Marilyn Gandert. Annie, faced with overwhelming evidence and the knowledge that her co-conspirators were already trying to blame her for the killing, decided to tell investigators the full truth about the planned murder. Annie's account was dramatically different from both Drake's mercy killing claim and Alyssa's story of an argument that got out of hand. According to Annie, the murder had been planned in advance, discussed and rehearsed before Marilyn ever arrived at the house that day. We were all in Alyssa's room getting high, Annie began, her voice shaking as she described the events leading up to the murder. That's when Alyssa brought up killing Marilyn. She'd talked about it before, but I thought she was joking. I never thought we'd actually do it. Annie described Alyssa as the leader of the group, someone who orchestrated the murder and gave orders to the others. Far from being a reluctant participant who got in over her head, Alyssa had apparently planned every detail of the attack. She would pretend like she was the Don, like the Godfather, Annie said, referring to Alyssa's apparent fascination with organized crime movies. She told me when she nodded, I should grab Marilyn. She had it all planned out. According to Annie's testimony, when Marilyn arrived at the house that Friday, she was walking into a carefully laid trap. The three conspirators were waiting for her, having already decided that she would not leave the house alive. Marilyn came in, and Drake asked if we could just stay like maybe his mom could keep packing slowly, Annie recalled. Marilyn said no, that we had to be out by the deadline. That's when Alyssa looked at me and Drake and nodded. What followed was a coordinated attack on an elderly woman who had trusted her family members and considered the house a safe space. Annie described grabbing Marilyn from behind, while Drake positioned himself to prevent her escape. "I got Marilyn from behind and took her down," Annie continued, her voice filled with apparent remorse for her actions. "Then Drake and I both held her while Alyssa tied her up with cords." The attack didn't end with restraining Marilyn. According to Annie's account, the three conspirators then engaged in a prolonged assault that included attempts at strangulation and ultimately multiple stab wounds inflicted by Drake. "I had gotten another cord and put around her neck to strangle her, and Drake pulled it with me, but it broke," Annie testified. "Then Drake grabbed my knife and started stabbing her repeatedly. I yelled at him to stop, but she was already gone." This account painted Drake not as someone reluctantly fulfilling a mercy-killing request, but as an active and enthusiastic participant in his grandmother's murder. The image of a 20-year-old man repeatedly stabbing his elderly grandmother was almost too horrific to comprehend. Annie's testimony also contradicted Alyssa's attempts to minimize her own role in the killing. Rather than being someone who got caught up in events beyond her control, Alyssa emerged as the mastermind who had planned the murder and directed others in carrying it out. The disposal of Marilyn's body was equally methodical and heartless. According to Annie, they wrapped Marilyn's body in a sheet and loaded it into her pickup truck, then drove to the remote location where it would eventually be discovered. But the horror didn't end there. Drake's girlfriend, Nikki, was forced to participate in the cover-up under threat of violence. Annie and Alyssa had threatened Nikki with weapons, making it clear that she would meet the same fate as Marilyn if she didn't cooperate. Nikki's testimony, when she was eventually interviewed by police, added another layer of horror to an already unspeakable crime. She described being terrorized by the three murderers, forced to help transport Marilyn's body while fearing for her own life. "They had knives and said they'd kill me if I didn't help," Nikki told investigators through tears. "I saw Marilyn lying there covered in blood, and I knew they meant it. I was afraid they'd do the same thing to me." Nikki described the journey to the dump site in vivid, traumatic detail. She was forced to drive while Annie's truck followed, carrying Marilyn's body to its final resting place. At the remote location, she watched in horror as Alyssa doused the mattress with gasoline and set it ablaze. "I could see the fire in my rearview mirror as we drove away," Nikki recalled. "It was like something out of Nightmare. I couldn't believe they'd actually done it, that they'd burned her like she was nothing." The forensic evidence supported every aspect of Annie and Nikki's testimonies. DNA analysis confirmed that Marilyn's blood was present in Annie's truck, along with traces of gasoline and fibers that matched the burned mattress. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed Annie's truck in the area around the time the body was dumped. Additional evidence included Marilyn's purse, medications, and house keys, all found in the truck during the search following the arrests. The killers had apparently ransacked Marilyn's belongings, possibly looking for cash or valuables, adding a robbery element to their list of crimes. The investigation also revealed the financial motive behind the murder. Alyssa and Drake had been living rent-free in Marilyn's house for months, despite repeated promises to catch up on their payments. The eviction notice had effectively ended their free housing arrangement, and they faced the prospect of homelessness or having to pay market-rate rent elsewhere. In their twisted logic, killing Marilyn seemed preferable to facing the consequences of their financial irresponsibility. They had apparently believed that with Marilyn gone, they might be able to claim some kind of inheritance or continue living in the house without interference. But their plan was doomed from the start. Marilyn's will left her property to Harry, not to her daughter-in-law or grandson. Even if they had succeeded in covering up the murder, they would have gained nothing and lost everything when Harry inevitably discovered their deception. The arrests were made in May 2018, nearly 4 months after Marilyn's murder. The delay was necessary to build an airtight case against all 3 defendants, ensuring that none of them could escape justice through legal technicalities or insufficient evidence. Alyssa Bickett, Drake Gandert, and Annie Rail were all charged with first-degree murder conspiracy, and multiple related charges including kidnapping, robbery, and tampering with evidence. The prosecution sought severe sentences for all three, arguing that the premeditated nature of the crime and the defendant's callous behavior warranted the maximum penalties allowed by law. The trial, when it finally began, was a media sensation that horrified the Albuquerque community. Details of the murder were so brutal and the family dynamics so twisted that even hardened court reporters struggled to maintain their composure during testimony. Harry Gandert, forced to relive his sister's final moments through witness testimony and forensic evidence, became the face of victim advocacy throughout the proceedings. His dignified grief and unwavering pursuit of justice resonated with jurors and spectators alike. Marilyn trusted these people, Harry said during his victim impact statement. She opened her home to them, helped them when they had nowhere else to go, and they repaid her kindness with the most brutal betrayal imaginable. No sentence can bring her back, but justice demands that they pay for what they've done. The defense attorneys for all three defendants faced an almost impossible task. The physical evidence was overwhelming, the witness testimony was consistent and detailed, and their clients' own statements had provided damning admissions of guilt. Alyssa's attorney attempted to argue that she had been coerced by the other defendants, and that her role in the murder was minimal. This strategy failed when prosecutors presented evidence of her leadership role in planning the crime and her active participation in disposing of the body. Drake's defense team tried to resurrect the mercy-killing narrative, arguing that their client was a troubled young man who had misunderstood his grandmother's complaints about her health and age as requests for assisted suicide. This argument fell apart when forensic experts testified about the violent nature of the attack and the obvious signs of struggle. Annie's lawyer pursued a cooperation strategy, emphasizing her client's willingness to testify against the other defendants and her apparent remorse for her actions. While this approach secured Annie a somewhat reduced sentence, it did nothing to minimize the horror of her participation in the crime. The jury deliberations were surprisingly brief given the complexity of the case. After less than 6 hours of discussion, they returned with guilty verdicts on all major charges for all three defendants. The foreman later said that the evidence was so overwhelming that there was never any real doubt about the defendant's guilt. The sentencing phase of the trial provided an opportunity for Harry and Marilyn's friends to speak about the impact of her murder on their lives. Their testimonies painted a picture of a woman who had been much more than just a crime victim. She had been a beloved sister, a caring friend, and a generous community member whose loss reverberated far beyond her immediate family. Nicole Robinson, Marilyn's best friend and former co-worker, delivered a particularly moving statement about the fear and paranoia that had consumed her since learning about her friend's murder. "Marilyn and I talked every day," Nicole said through tears. "She was the kind of person who would give you the shirt off her back if you needed it. To know that she died afraid and alone, betrayed by the very people she tried to help, has changed how I see the world. I don't trust as easily anymore. I don't sleep as well. Part of me died with Marilyn that day." The judge, in delivering the sentences, noted the particularly heinous nature of the crime and the defendant's apparent lack of genuine remorse. He spoke about the violation of trust inherent in the murder, the way the defendants had exploited Marilyn's generosity and familial loyalty to lure her to her death. On October 3rd, 2019, nearly 2 years after Marilyn's murder, justice was finally served. Alyssa Bickett, identified as the ringleader who had planned and orchestrated the murder, was sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that her attempt to blame others for her actions and her complete lack of remorse warranted the harshest sentence possible. Drake Gandert, despite his youth and troubled background, received 26 years in prison. The judge acknowledged that Drake's age and family circumstances were mitigating factors, but emphasized that his active participation in his grandmother's murder and his callous behavior afterward demanded severe punishment. "You had every opportunity to stop this crime," the judge told Drake during sentencing. "Instead, you chose to participate enthusiastically in the murder of a woman who loved you and tried to help you." Your actions represent a fundamental betrayal of family bonds and human decency. Annie Rail, who had cooperated with prosecutors and expressed apparent remorse for her actions, received the lightest sentence of 12 years in prison. While her cooperation was noted as a mitigating factor, the judge emphasized that her participation in such a brutal crime still warranted significant punishment. Your willingness to testify against your co-defendants shows some recognition of the wrongfulness of your actions, the judge told Annie. However, you still participated in the torture and murder of an innocent woman, and you must face the consequences of those choices. The sentences brought a measure of closure to Harry and others who had loved Marilyn, but the pain of her loss remained raw and overwhelming. Harry spoke to reporters after the sentencing, his voice still breaking with emotion nearly 2 years after his sister's death. No amount of prison time can bring Marilyn back or undo the horror of what she went through, Harry said. But knowing that her killers will spend decades behind bars gives me some peace. Maybe now she can finally rest. The case of Marilyn Gandert became a cautionary tale about the dangers of misplaced trust and the devastating consequences of financial desperation. It highlighted the vulnerability of elderly people who live alone and depend on family members for support and companionship. Community advocates used Marilyn's story to push for better protections for elderly residents, including improved welfare check systems and resources for seniors facing exploitation by family members. Her death, while tragic, became a catalyst for positive changes that might prevent similar crimes in the future. The rental house where Marilyn was murdered was eventually sold and demolished, the new owners unable to live with the knowledge of what had happened there. The empty lot serves as a quiet memorial to a woman whose only crime was trusting the wrong people at the wrong time. Harry continued to live in Albuquerque, though he moved to a different neighborhood to escape the constant reminders of his sister's murder. He established a small memorial scholarship in Marilyn's name at the local community college, helping other elderly residents pursue continuing education opportunities. The 3 killers began serving their sentences at different facilities throughout New Mexico, their lives effectively over despite their relatively young ages. Alyssa, at 45 years old when sentenced, would not be eligible for release until she was 75. Drake would be 46 when his sentence ended, assuming he served his full term. Only Annie had any realistic hope of rebuilding her life after prison. The case also had lasting impacts on the investigating officers and prosecutors who had worked to bring Marilyn's killers to justice. Detective Rodriguez, who had led the investigation, said in later interviews that the Gandert case was one of the most disturbing he'd encountered in his 20-year career. The level of betrayal involved, the way they exploited her trust and kindness, made this case particularly difficult to work, Rodriguez explained. Marilyn was a victim in every sense of the word. She'd already lost so much in her life, and she deserved to spend her remaining years in peace and safety. The medical examiner who had processed Marilyn's remains spoke about the challenges of working with such extensively burned evidence, but emphasized the importance of providing answers for families of murder victims. Every victim deserves to have their story told, Dr. Patricia Williams said. Even when the physical evidence is severely compromised, we have an obligation to piece together what happened and ensure that justice is served. As the years passed, Marilyn's story continued to resonate with people who heard about the case. It became a reminder of the importance of checking on elderly neighbors and relatives, of recognizing signs of financial exploitation, and of taking action when something seems wrong. Harry never stopped talking about his sister, keeping her memory alive through his advocacy work and his willingness to share their story with others. He spoke at community events, participated in victim rights organizations, and worked with law enforcement to improve training for officers responding to elder abuse cases. Marilyn was so much more than just a murder victim, Harry would tell audiences. She was a loving sister, a devoted mother, a loyal friend. She had hopes and dreams and fears just like everyone else. When we reduce her to just the circumstances of her death, we lose sight of the beautiful person she was in life. The case also sparked discussions about family dynamics and the pressures that can lead to violence within households. Social workers and counselors used Marilyn's story as an example of how financial stress and entitlement can escalate into deadly confrontations when combined with substance abuse and antisocial personality traits. The three killers showed markedly different adaptations to prison life. Alyssa reportedly struggled with a regimented environment and had multiple disciplinary incidents during her first years of incarceration. Drake seemed to adapt better to prison routine, but showed little apparent remorse for his actions or interest in rehabilitation programs. Annie, in contrast, became involved in victim advocacy programs within the prison system, speaking to other inmates about the consequences of violence and working with counselors to address the substance abuse issues that had contributed to her participation in the crime. The contrast between the defendants' post-conviction behavior seemed to validate the different sentences they had received. Alyssa's continued defiance and lack of remorse supported the decision to give her the harshest punishment, while Annie's apparent growth and remorse justified her more lenient treatment. For the Albuquerque community, Marilyn's murder served as a wake-up call about the hidden violence that could exist within seemingly normal families. Neighborhood watch programs increased their focus on elderly residents, and local social services expanded their outreach efforts to isolated seniors. The case also influenced local law enforcement training, with officers learning to recognize signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation. The techniques used to solve Marilyn's murder, from forensic analysis of minimal blood evidence to coordinating multiple suspect interrogations, became part of the standard curriculum for detectives. Years after the sentences were handed down, appeals by all three defendants were denied by higher courts. The evidence against them was too overwhelming, their guilt too clear for any legal technicalities to provide escape routes from their punishment. Harry found some comfort in knowing that the legal system had worked correctly in his sister's case, that her killers would spend most or all of their remaining lives behind bars. But he also acknowledged that no amount of justice could fill the void left by Marilyn's absence. "I still reach for the phone every morning at 7 and every evening at 9, Harry said in a recent interview. "For just a moment, I forget that she's gone, and I want to call her like I did for so many years. That's when the loss hits me hardest, in those quiet moments when I remember that she's never going to answer again." The story of Marilyn Gandert stands as a testament to the power of thorough police work, dedicated prosecution, and a justice system that refused to let a brutal crime go unpunished. But more than that, it serves as a reminder of the preciousness of trust, the vulnerability of those who live alone, and the devastating consequences when greed and selfishness overcome basic human decency. Marilyn's death was a tragedy that shocked the community and forever changed the lives of everyone who knew her. But her legacy lives on through the positive changes inspired by her story, the increased awareness of elder abuse, and the unwavering love of a brother who refused to let her memory fade. In the end, justice was served. The three people who betrayed Marilyn's trust in the most horrible way imaginable are spending decades behind bars, their own lives effectively ended by their choices. They traded years of freedom for moments of violence, destroying not only Marilyn's future, but their own as well. It's a reminder that evil actions have consequences, that justice may be slow, but it is persistent, and that even in the darkest moments, truth has a way of emerging into the light. Marilyn Gandert was more than a victim. She was a human being who deserved so much better than the hand she was dealt, and her story will continue to serve as a warning and an inspiration for years to come. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you haven't already, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We upload new true crime content daily, covering cases you know and many you don't. Stick with us as we bring you more stories that deserve to be heard. See you in the next video.